everyone, welcome to Taking the Pulse, a healthcare and life sciences video podcast. I am Heather Hoops Matthews here in the studio today with Maynard Nexsen healthcare attorney Matthew Roberts. Matthew, good to be with you.
Good to see you.
And we are joined today by Gil Roth. He is president of the Pharma Biopharma Outsourcing Association, or known as PBOA, where Gil is responsible for developing and advancing the agenda of contract development and manufacturing organizations known today as CDMOs, and you'll hear us refer to that in that way. And he assists in the regulatory and legislative business areas there. Your role, Gil, also includes lobbying Congress, interacting and negotiating with the FDA and other regulatory agencies, and working with other trade associations to forward shared programs and interests. You've got a full plate, but thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Can you start us off just by telling us a little bit more about your role and how you advocate for CDMOs in the industry?
Sure. Thank you. I launched the trade association, PBOA, back in 2014 with the idea that the CDMO sector really needed a seat at the table when it came to working with FDA. What I discovered over time was that it also needed to help work with Congress to shape things before they ever get to FDA. So what I do is bring industry members together and develop consensus perspectives and viewpoints on key issues, and then bring those to the FDA, to Congress, to the administration, and other regulators and legislators. And that involves really getting to know the CDMO sector and what factors affect it that are different maybe than what affects the license holder companies, the clients for the CDMOs, the drug companies themselves.
Well, Gil, we have a lot to talk about in the world of tariffs and other regulatory issues that are on the horizon for the pharmaceutical industry. So let's start off by telling us, what is the current state of tariffs as they will have an impact on the pharmaceutical industry, which I know is a seemingly loaded question.
It's a very moving target,
man.
The short answer is nobody knows.
Right.
Now, the current administration is using a lot of different types of tariffs as part of its negotiating tools, as part of its way of trying to incentivize domestic manufacturing, to develop resilient supply chains, et cetera. Now, there's two different ways they're doing this. One is through something called Section 232 probes. Those go into particular industries and try to figure out the national security interests of those and how best to reinforce that. And that isn't necessarily with tariffs, but with any policies, they can all be embedded within this 232 probe. Now, there was one for auto parts, one for aluminum and steel. There was one for pharma supply chains that finished back in May. And that basically led to about 950 responses from different entities throughout the world. That all gets filed with the Department of Commerce. They work on a report on the Section 232 probe, hand that to the White House. White House figures out what they're going to do. That's still in process. I met with the Commerce Department a few weeks ago to talk about our perspective, shared them a printout shared with them of our Section 232 response to remind them of where we come from as CDMOs. And I got the impression they're still working on the final report to transmit that to the White House. Now, the other thing the administration has been doing is use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. This is what they used for those immediate tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China the day after inauguration, and then the Liberation Day tariffs from last April that have been mutating ever since. The IEEPA has never been used for tariffs previously, and it's currently, that tariff authority has been rejected by two courts, is likely to head to the Supreme Court soon to determine whether the president actually has the authority under IEEPA to levy tariffs. That power normally and constitutionally resides with Congress, so we'll see how that goes. But those are what's currently subject to court approval. The Section 232 probes are not. Those have a different lifespan. They have a different authority and regulatory process, so those can be initiated and executed by the White House. Nobody knows where the 232 probe is going to go, how the administration is going to actually implement these. We know that from the trade deal that was announced with Europe, or with the EU, they were given protection from a 232 pharma supply chain probe that the maximum tariff that could be instituted there would be 15%, which is the same for many EU goods coming into the US. And that generic products would be basically exempted, both generic drugs and the APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients for them. Those would basically get almost zero rate for tariffs.
This is under the EU deal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good.
Now that provides a sort of template for other countries in theory, but we have not seen that announced for any other regions yet. There's a lot of negotiating going on with different countries, different regions. Some of them are more and less critical to the U.S. pharma supply chain than others, both for innovative drugs and for generics. So we're trying to keep an eye on things and try to help our members prepare as best they can to work with their clients, the drug companies. But it is very much a moving target at present.
So there are a couple of factors in play here. We hear the politicians talk about trying to put some restrictions on the increasing cost of pharmaceuticals, particularly in the States. But we also hear politicians talk about wanting domestic production of some of these things, which don't necessarily go together. So can you talk a little bit about how the industry is trying to communicate its position on, tariffs that might increase their cost to produce certain drugs, or some other type of legislation or executive order that would limit their ability to have historically consistent pricing?
You're correct. There are some contradictory messages
Right.
going on right now, ones that are very difficult to reconcile. There's a big push for domestic manufacturing from this administration and from previous ones. The incentives to do that, again, if you use tariffs, you're looking more at a stick than a carrot. Now, a number of major pharmas have announced their massive domestic investment plans, but those all have multi-year timelines at present. And the administration understands seemingly the long-term issues with building new manufacturing in the U.S. for pharma, that it can be 4, 5, 6 years. The president has mentioned a year to 18 months from when they announced the pharma tariffs to when they would be fully implemented. But I think there's more awareness that those timelines can be a bit longer than that. From the generic side of things, this is where things get really hairy, to be frank. The profit margins and the economics of the generic space in the U.S., while generic drugs account for 90% of all prescriptions in the U.S., they are very price sensitive, and it'd be really difficult to move manufacturing here with U.S. health, safety, environmental costs, labor costs, et cetera, and somehow manage to keep the wholesalers, purchasing organizations, et cetera, satisfied while also keeping drug prices down for patients. So the generic side's under huge pressure, and we'll have to see what happens with ingredients, which largely come from China and India, as well as finished dosage generics, which tend to come from India. On the innovator side, there's a bit more flexibility and ability to handle some price impact from tariffs during a transition period like that. However, the administration is also pushing for most favored nation pricing, where they're trying to push prices of U.S. drugs down. That could create more pressure on the innovator drug companies and impact their ability to invest in things like R&D. So there are levers, but every one of them has a counter lever to them.
And I know there's a lot moving here and a lot at play, but what do you think, Gil, will be the impact for drug prices in the U.S.? Can you forecast?
It's really tough because some of the measures that the government can use impact things like Medicare price negotiations, which the previous administration began implementing. That can impact discrete innovator drug products. Whether pharma companies would willingly lower their prices in response to Europe and other regions raising what they're willing to spend, I don't know. I always say these things are beyond our pay grade. I just represent the contract manufacturers. But, there are price pressures. And within the U.S., there are so many layers, like pharmacy benefit managers and the like, where the cost of something is opaque. There's a list price, but that's not what money actually gets paid to any one individual party. So figuring out how to eliminate some of that opacity and get more transparency in pricing might help start to iron out what drugs really cost and how to reduce the price for patients.
Can you describe briefly how the proposed MFN policy would work if it went in and was implemented and enforced like the administration has articulated that it would like?
The executive order seems to say that U.S. companies would be compelled to lower their U.S. drug prices to whatever the lowest price is in any of, I think, 26 or 27 different countries that qualify by economic status. Those other countries tend to have single payer systems that negotiate drug prices as tenders. We don't have that. There are ways drug companies could say, look, the list price in country X is this much, but what we actually get paid is a different amount because of rebates. So there is no apples to apples way of comparing this stuff. The side part of most favored nation that has come up is doing direct to consumer sales of drugs, which we've seen with GLP-1s like Ozempic and Mounjaro and Wegovy. But the administration's take might be that stepping away from the insurance side of things might lead to lowering drug prices, at least in terms of the cash purchase model. Whether patients will be able to actually pay for drugs on that level is another question, but it's one that has a lot of complications to it. Right. I'll put it that way.
Right. And when you see these competing policies where we want to increase production of domestic drug manufacturing, I mean, you've got the executive order talking about the sourcing and building a reserve of APIs for certain critical medicines. Well, that sounds great, but what are some of the unintended consequences if we do that? Like, I guess you referenced increased pricing, but do we give other people, other countries opportunities to then become a better place to do R&D and manufacturing production of pharmaceutical products?
That's my long-term concern, certainly. If you make Fortress America, where you're only manufacturing here for the U.S. market, that can certainly lead to other regions finding other regulatory regimes and drugs being developed in parallel in different countries and maybe on offer in some rather than others. In addition to the strategic API reserve executive order from a couple of weeks ago, there was also an executive order back in May to incentivize domestic manufacturing of pharma in the U.S., which had some regulatory streamlining aspects to it. Also mentioned that it would include increasing the inspections and the fees paid by foreign manufacturing facilities. What shape that's going to take and whether the administration follows through on that executive order could certainly create some complications when it comes to what it costs to manufacture, whether overseas or domestically, and what that ends up trickling down to when it comes to patients themselves, as well as hospitals, which purchase a good amount of pharmaceutical products. So there's a lot of complications there. One of the things I am concerned with beyond the pricing impact is with major pharma companies looking to build massive domestic manufacturing, there's the need to get a hold of the equipment, and most of these things come from outside the U.S. A lot of manufacturing equipment's manufactured in Europe, India, China, but also the workforce for this. There's a limited workforce when it comes to pharmaceutics in the U.S. And if a lot of major pharmas start really concentrating and building up facilities and adding workforce or needing workforce for that, they might have to draw it from other companies. In this case, potentially that could come from CDMOs. And that's something I've been concerned with and something we've worked with other trade associations and the administration to talk about workforce development.
So tell us who's at the table of these negotiations. We know there's the administration, they've got their policy/political objectives. Then there's the pharmaceutical industry, then there's CDMOs, then there's the FDA, which has its own little wagon in this deal. Who else is at the table? And are you all getting together to talk about the push-pull and unintended consequences of some of these policies?
Thanks. Well, this is the challenge of being a small trade association based in northern New Jersey. I have a lobbying firm we use in Washington, and I get down there periodically, as I'll be next week. We meet with key congressional staff as well as White House offices and other parts of the administration. I know that Pharma, Bio, the AAM group, the Generic Industry Trade Association, they're making their case very strongly about the potential impact of tariffs, of other incentives, both sticks and carrots, for manufacturing in the U.S. and what's needed elsewhere, how we need a robust supply chain, but not one that's hyper-concentrated, because the more you concentrate any supply chain, the more risk you create. So I think they're doing their best job to explain what's out there and why certain things need to be in different regions. We help supplement that argument, certainly, from a CDMO perspective.
Between now and the end of the year, I know you mentioned the 232 probe. Maybe we'll know what the White House is thinking about that. But between now and the end of the year, is there anything else that we should watch for, like major movement or decisions here?
Well, the big thing that's going on, starting in about a month plus, are the negotiations for the various user fee programs with the FDA. These are 5-year programs where industry and FDA negotiate a set of commitments on FDA's part, and there's a dollar amount attached to this, basically tied to the number of full-time equivalents the FDA needs. And so there's one for innovator products, which is the prescription drug user fee amendment. That's sort of the template for all this. There's a generic version, GDUFA, which we've been part of the negotiations for, as well as one for medical devices and another one for biosimilars. And those all get negotiated in the year ahead, starting this fall. So what we're going to be interested in seeing is what the FDA, representing HHS and the White House, what they bring to the table in terms of what their policy expectations are, how they want to see the programs negotiated for the next 5 years, whether they see any aspects of those user fees helping to essentially help execute some of the administration's policies, especially in terms of onshoring. There are some levers within the user fee programs that could potentially incentivize that or disincentivize domestic or non-U.S. manufacturing, and seeing what they bring and what industry pushes back with that's going to be a big part of what industry is going through this fall. And unfortunately, because of the ground rules of these negotiations, we're not actually allowed to talk about what goes on in the negotiating room. But I suspect there'll be some interesting policy decisions and some interesting commitments and comments from both FDA and industry.
Interesting. Final question. A lot of folks in the States think that because of our R&D and what we've done in terms of pharmaceutical development, that no other country or group of countries or region outside the state could replicate or move us out of that position. Is that really true? If we have tariffs, if it becomes more expensive to do business with the United States based on tariffs, as we focus on domestic production, is there a possibility that some other country or group of countries could come together and be a more competitive dynamic, create a more competitive dynamic on pharmaceutical manufacturing and development?
I'll say less from the tariff side, more from the potential for the upheaval that's currently been going on at FDA.
Okay.
There's been a lot of change. There were a significant number of firings back in April. There were more layoffs in February and early retirement offerings. The expertise at FDA and what the FDA commits to through those user fee programs really helps set a regulatory time frame for new drug applications, generic applications, development of drugs. If that becomes degraded through the administration's approach to FDA and what these user fee programs ultimately yield, longer term, you could see other regions become more competitive, certainly. Now, it's a question of where Europe is renowned for its sort of red tape business environment. Japan also has its issues when it comes to developing and accelerating or advancing new drugs. But that possibility
the door might be
in a
open.
longer term sense. Yeah.
Right.
Gil, my goodness, your environment is intertwined and changing like crazy. I mean, I don't know. We just shared a wealth of information, Matthew, that I feel like is going to change in an instant.
It is changing in an instant. That's why Gil's got one of the hardest jobs in America, trying to keep up with it on a daily basis.
I feel like he does. Gil Roth, president of the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association, PBOA. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been insightful to listen to you and to see all that you're trying to keep track of for your members.
Thanks so much.
For those of you who joined us, we hope you enjoyed today's conversation and learned a little bit more about the dynamic healthcare industry. On behalf of Matthew and the whole crew here at Taking the Pulse, we thank you for joining us and look forward to seeing you next time right here on Taking the Pulse, a healthcare and life sciences video podcast.